So welcome this afternoon, a little earlier than usual, to tonight's constitutional conversation put on by the Stanford Constitutional Law Center. I'm very happy this evening to welcome Professor Danielle Allen from Harvard, a political philosopher and ethicist in public policy, and a founder of a major international group working for the promotion of democracy. And tonight she's going to be talking about ways in which I believe it's sort of how our constitutional system can be made more democratic and practical in a practical sense. So thank you very much for coming, and please join me in welcoming Danielle Allen.
Thank you so much, Michael. I appreciate that. Can everybody hear me okay? Is this mic is picking me up? Great. Well, it's nice to see you all. I appreciate your making time in, I'm sure, busy lives to talk about how we can renovate our democracy. You know, a lot of us are just sort of afflicted by broad anxiety these days as we process the news, process the terrible sort of conflict around the debt ceiling, for instance, recognizing where polarization has brought us, and sort of real insanity in the policy process. So it's often hard to summon a sense of optimism or view about the sort of what's positively possible for us. So that's what I'm really, though, here to do today, is to try to point to paths we can walk along that would actually help us achieve a healthier democracy. And what I'm going to share with you, I'm sharing from a report called Our Common Purpose, put out by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in June of 2020. I was fortunate to be one of the co-chairs of this commission. I'm going to tell you a bit about the commission in a minute and point to some of the reforms and sort of strategies for moving them forward that came out of that work. But let me just start by introducing myself so that you know a little bit more about where this work, these perspectives, and so forth are coming from. When people ask me what I work on these days, my answer is very simple. Just democracy, past, present, and future thereof, and no question mark at the end of that. I come by that interest, that commitment, super honestly. It's just a matter of family inheritance. So on my dad's side, my granddad helped found one of the first NAACP chapters in northern Florida in the 40s. And I don't know how well you know northern Florida, but it's basically the same as southern Georgia. So to do that in the 40s, this time when lynchings were on the rise, was super dangerous. He was taking his life in his hands. On my mom's side, my great-grandparents helped fight for women's right to vote in the early 20th century. My great-grandmother, as a result, ended up as president of the League of Women Voters in Michigan in the 30s. And we're all historians in my family, so I still have her sort of pocket-sized rules of order, Mrs. Emma Cox's rules of order for running meetings in the League of Women Voters. In other words, I come from people who were often told that something was impossible, that social equality for African Americans in the South was impossible, that the right to vote for women was impossible. Their response to that claim of impossibility was not only that social equality, the right to vote were possible, but that they were actually necessary. And the only question was how, and they were going to make sure that those things got done. So those are the kind of people I come from, and I'm very fortunate to have grown up in a context of just significant civic engagement. Lots of members of my family participating, understanding the value of democracy, taking democracy to be critical for human flourishing, seeing empowerment as at the base of well-being for individuals, families, and communities. And my dad had 11 brothers and sisters. Half of them moved to Southern California, fleeing the Jim Crow South, seeking freedom and opportunity. And in that context in Southern California, as I said, they were all super engaged and also, interestingly, engaged across the political spectrum. So there was one year in my youth in '92 when I had an aunt on the ballot for Congress here in the Bay Area for the Peace and Freedom Party, on the far left of the spectrum. And at the same year, very same year, my dad was running for Senate from Southern California as a Reagan Republican. So we had really intense family dinner table conversations. And I was like trying to figure it out, sort of back and forth, trying to make sense of the different positions they were taking. My dad is sort of super professorial, always smoking a pipe, smoke curling around his head. My aunt was a big woman, sort of built like a Mack truck. She was gay, she had a huge belly laugh. And they would go at it, like my dad arguing for market liberties and civic virtues, my aunt arguing for public sector investment across all segments of society and experiments in living. But for all that they fought and argued and debated all of this, two things were always clear to me. They actually agreed on what they were pursuing. They were both pursuing that project of empowerment, that project of free self-government for free and equal citizens. They disagreed on the how, disagreed immensely on the how, but they shared that common purpose. That was the first thing that was clear to me. The second thing that was clear to me was, regardless of how much they disagreed on the how, they had each other's backs. As human beings, they were committed to each other. So they argued about the ideas, but they never fought the people. There was just a kind of fundamental commitment to the dignity and value and worth of the human being in front of them. So that was sort of my school of democracy. That's what I came to understand as a sort of the project and purpose of democracy, was that commitment to empowerment, lots to disagree and argue about with regard to the how, but that those arguments should always proceed resting on a commitment to the dignity, the human worth of the person in front of you. So I was incredibly fortunate, as I said, to sort of grow up in that context. And I will say, as a young person, I took democracy for granted. I took for granted its value in human life. And it didn't really become a personal matter for me until I was watching my own generation come up in the world. So when my parents' generation came up in the world, they all pretty much moved up. So my granddad was a fisherman. His kids were small business owners, professors, and the like. On the other side, from factory workers to accountants, and so on. For my generation, that has not been the case. So my generation has experienced what I call the great pulling apart. So here I stand in front of you with all of you on this beautiful campus, standing here as a tenured professor at Harvard. I, no offense, consider that the most privileged position in the world. And I've got a brother who's a corporate executive. But at the same time, I have cousins who are not with us any longer. Dead cousins, and not deaths that I can in any way be at peace about. So substance use disorder and homicide and the like. And that sort of 50 years plus of my lifetime, where my family has experienced this great pulling apart, has coincided with a great pulling apart in the country, too. So an incredible rise of income inequality, incredible rise of incarceration, incredible rise of polarization. That's the story of my family's life. That's sort of the story of our country, too. And for me, the turning point moment came in 2009, when I lost my younger cousin, Michael. Michael and I were very close growing up, and then in 1995, at the age of 15, he was arrested on a first arrest in Southern California for an attempted carjacking. That is obviously a terrible thing to have done, but as you all know, sitting here as Californians, that was also the point in time when punishment in this state was at its most intense. It was just after the 3 Strikes You're Out law was passed, just after sentencing ages were brought down from, juveniles were being tried as adults and the like. And so on that first arrest, Michael got a sentence of 12 years and 8 months. And he served most of it and had about 2 years out, 2 years of freedom, at the point in 2009 when he was shot and killed by somebody he had met while he was in prison. So I know that's a hard story to hear. It is a hard story to tell as well. But for me, that was a life turning point moment. And everything changed. And at that point, for me, there became this pressing question of, what on earth is this thing for, this democracy, if it's not actually making it possible for generational cohorts to all come up together? If instead we have this great pulling apart. So I began to ask myself the question of, how can we possibly change the dynamics of our society so that democracy is not just abstractly good, not just sort of abstractly about self-government or empowerment, but actually where real empowerment is in fact providing a foundation for flourishing for everybody. So I started first working on justice reform, thinking that was the thing that I needed to focus on. And I quickly came to understand that even where we had bipartisan solutions to things, you couldn't get them through. because of governance dysfunction. So for me, then, the real red alert about the health of our political system came in 2013. So that's the year in which Congress had an approval rating of 9%, right? Like, it's not even that bad now, okay? It's like we think things are bad now, but like in 2013, Congress, the approval rating was 9%. And this is crazy because at the end of the day, Congress is the first branch of government. It is designed to be the voice of the people, to synthesize our perspectives into some shared will, direction-setting will. And so that approval rating means that we, the people, approve of our own voice at the rate of 9%. That makes us a self-hating people. That's a terrible thing. That's a broken democracy. So at that point, I was like, no, we've got some deep work to do. We have to figure out how to convert this democracy into a thing that we can feel proud of, where we do think that our voice is coming through the institutions of our government, and where we're actually in a position to find compromises and solutions and deliver real goods and benefits in people's lives. So from that point on, 2013 to the present, for the past decade, I've been involved in what I call the democracy renovation space. And I call it democracy renovation rather than democracy reform because our political institutions are like a house. They are a thing that we, the people, have built. Our institutions structure the world in which we live. They are not fit for purpose in the 21st century for a lot of reasons. We've grown, we're much bigger, we're a much more complex society, we're a much more diverse society. And at the same time, those institutions were never built for everybody, right? Some folks got rooms with a view, others were relegated to dark rooms in the basement. So to have a democracy that can deliver for us, can be what we deserve in the 21st century, we actually have to renovate our democracy, achieve something fundamentally new, even if adhering to principles of the original design. So that leads me to the Our Common Purpose report. I was then very fortunate in 2017 to get an invitation from the president of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, Jonathan Fanton, to help co-chair this commission. He called and said, Danielle, I'm really worried about our democracy. I really think, this thing is kind of going to hell in a handbasket right now. It's like, funny you should say that, Jonathan, because I kind of agree with you. And we pulled together a group of chairs, 3 co-chairs, which is an important point, because in context of diversity, even in the sort of leadership of something like a commission, you need more than one person at the head of that. You want to get sort of diversity perspectives, even just setting up a commission in the first place. So there were 3 of us who were co-chairs together. And then we built out a cross-ideological network of about 40 people, spanning the country, spanning academic disciplines, and spanning professional sectors. And we had the charge of trying to answer the question of how we should reinvent American democracy for the 21st century. That's a very grandiose question. And so you might well say, what were you guys doing thinking that you should just put this question out there and try to answer that? So let me say 2 more words about the American Academy to give that some context. The American Academy of Arts and Sciences is based in Massachusetts, in Cambridge, Mass. It was founded before the country was founded. It was founded in the period of the Revolution by the same people who were driving the Revolution. So John Hancock, John Adams, George Washington was an early member. And the point of the Academy was they wanted to assemble members of, as they called it at the time, the learned professions, to be a part of a standing body of people who would always be available to give this new country advice, epistemic, intellectual resources. They recognized they were doing something completely new on the face of the planet, sort of representative democracy. They knew that they, at some level, had no idea what they were doing. They had various hypotheses about what they thought might work, but they knew this new nation was always going to need knowledge resources to steer through difficulty, and that because it was experimental, it would really need new knowledge resources. And so for that reason, they established the Academy. And it has, over time, provided advice at critical moments. So for example, it did a lot of work around how to set up protocols for handling nuclear power in the middle of the 20th century. And so here we were at a moment where the Academy body decided we think democracy is where there's a responsibility, work to be done. So we set up this commission, but we didn't want it to be a kind of conventional commission. We didn't want it just to be about experts writing reports, and so we ran listening sessions all over the country, about 50 different listening sessions with all kinds of folks, non-voters as well as voters, immigrant communities, long-standing communities, suburban folks, urban folks, across the political spectrum. And we did this because we wanted to understand what people saw as the obstacles to health and participation in our democracy, as well as some of the opportunities and possibilities. As we did this work, we discovered a few things. We discovered that all across America, everybody was convinced that Americans don't share anything anymore. So it turns out that's what we share, okay? We share that sense of despair, but what that also means is, of course, that we share a sense of hope, a desire to actually share something. So that was interesting. Then we discovered something else. We did this exercise. We just wanted to see, was it even going to be possible to articulate a set of values that might be a thing we could say was broadly shared. Like, what does it mean to be committed to American democracy? We thought this was going to be an impossible project, that we wouldn't be able to do that across lines of ideological difference. In fact, it was 90% easy. Freedom, equality, constitutionalism, rule of law, equal opportunity, fairness. Everybody agrees about those words, right and left. But there was one thing we got stuck on. And that was the question of how we should name the bond we should have with each other and the commitment we should have to the country. Patriotism or solidarity? Patriotism is a critical term for the right, solidarity a critical term for the left. That was the place where we could not get any agreement. We ended up saying that what we thought was important was a commitment, mutual commitment to one another and to the country. That was our mouthy way of saying there's got to be an important value here, which is about our relationships with each other. So that was interesting, that the thing that was the biggest sticking point was really simply this: how we name and understand the relationships we ought to have with each other as members of this society. So we did all that kind of work, but as we were doing it, we were, of course, also trying to figure out the barriers and the solutions. So I'll come to the solutions so I can get to the specific reforms that we recommended. And there's a kind of concept that was at the center of our solution set. The concept was delivered to us by one of the participants in a listening session in Maine. And he said, look, the situation is just basically like our institutions don't really work. So who wants to participate in that? And then when we don't participate, we don't really have the chance to get to know each other across differences of various kinds. It's like a vicious circle we're caught in. And then he said, but isn't democracy supposed to be like a virtuous circle where your institutions are delivering and you're motivated to participate, and then when you participate in the civil society organizations that connect you to the political sphere, you're actually having the chance to learn about people from different spheres of life? That was the core insight for our report. We're trapped in a vicious circle, a negative equilibrium, where non-responsive institutions lead people to withdraw. We don't have that sort of civil society tissue, giving people the chance to figure out what that relationship with one another means, and you sort of get in a downward spiral. So we came to see that our job was to flip the switch from that vicious cycle or circle to a virtuous cycle or circle, with inclusive and responsive institutions, civil society organizations that are helping people bridge, and a civic culture that's reinforcing people's desire to participate in those institutions and in those civil society organizations. We ended up structuring our report, our 31 recommendations, in those three buckets: okay, responsive and inclusive institutions, civil society organizations that help people bridge, and a civic culture that reinforces that commitment of all of us to one another and to our country. Alrighty? So I want to say something then about the 31 recommendations that we came up with, because this is really important. I said that we were a cross-ideological group, and we were. So when we started, we had this big question of, how on earth are we going to come up with a set of recommendations that we're not going to just spend the whole time fighting over with all the polarization of the rest of the country? And we came to the conclusion that we wanted recommendations that were bold but feasible. Those were two important criteria. And that every individual recommendation needed to have cross-ideological support, but not necessarily unanimity. We didn't want anybody in a particular political position to have a veto power over any particular thing. But we wanted every particular recommendation to have cross-ideological support. And then lastly, we wanted the whole set to be unanimously supported by the Commission. Okay? So in other words, what we did, we had one of my co-chairs was somebody named Stephen Hines, who's president of the Rockefeller Brothers Trust. And I always joke, he was like the Ben Franklin in our group. He was sort of the elder statesman of the group. And indeed, he was always quoting Ben Franklin. So I wasn't just making this up. And so he would always stand up and say, well, it's just like what Ben Franklin said at the Constitutional Convention on the last day, when Franklin said, you know, you could actually quote this word for word. I'm not going to be able to quote it word for word, but Franklin basically said, and you have to correct it for me, you know, I know this thing is imperfect, but I don't think we can get any better. And so we all need to bury our reservations and just endorse this unanimously and go out and defend it. Do you want to render the actual position?
And then the woman comes up to him and says, what kind of constitution, a republic, madam.
Right, if you can keep it.
If we can
keep it, exactly. At any rate, but the point is simply that Franklin said, I don't think this thing is perfect, but I'm going to bury my reservations, and we all should do this so we can endorse unanimously. And so that's what we did as well with this report, was decide we were all going to look at it and see if we could bury our reservations and endorse it unanimously. And we did. And then there was a really interesting thing that happened, because then we had to go out on the road and make the case for the recommendations. And as we did, like, I found myself often actually arguing for some things I hadn't actually supported, and I'm not going to tell you which ones they were. All right? And by the end of the year of doing that, I was like, oh, those are really good ideas. In fact, you know, I brought myself around, you know, ventriloquizing the arguments of all my colleagues in the case. So let me now share with you what some of these recommendations are that garnered cross-ideological support, so Republicans as well as Democrats supporting them, and that collectively we supported unanimously. Starting with the actual institutions of our federal government, increasing the size of the House of Representatives. Why? So that representatives are closer to their constituents again. We're at a ratio of about 760,000 constituents to representative. Not a huge difference to come down to 580, but it is a meaningful difference in terms of the proximity, in terms of information flows in a district, reduces the amount of money it takes to run for office, expands the seats in the House to about 585. That would give us a chance for more diversity in the House, and most importantly, rebalances the Electoral College. Because the Electoral College is created out of the number of the members of the House and the Senate. All right, and it was always designed to be weighted to provide protection to less populous areas. And what's happened over the last 100 years, when the House has not grown, it grew up until 1929, but we capped it in 1929, and as a result of that, the weighting in favor of the less populous places has gotten stronger and stronger and stronger. So we need that weighting to get back to a reasonable place. Some minority protection is reasonable, but the weighting is excessive presently. How do we get it back to a reasonable place? We grow the House of Representatives. Okay? So that's one big recommendation. Term limits for Supreme Court justices is another one. So imagine people serving for 18 years and then rotating off to a different role on the bench. So still holding appointments for life. There's a big debate about whether this... Our argument was that this would not require a constitutional amendment, that could be purely legislative, but there's a big debate about this question, sort of worth talking about. But then the idea is that every presidential term, every 4 years, there would be 2 appointments, and you would take some of the politics out of court appointments by knowing that they're rotating on a regular basis. Every president's going to get a certain number, and people aren't sort of gaming when people come on or off the court in order to control it, over extremely long lifespans at this point in time. Universal civic duty voting, a la Australia. So no more, vote if you feel like it, but everybody has to participate. You don't have to fill out a ballot, but you'd show up with a modest fine if you didn't. So think of voting as more like jury duty, as opposed to the way we think about it now. So those are some examples of some of the recommendations in the institutional space. In the civil society space, we had recommendations that related to social media, like taxing the targeted ad revenue of media platform companies and using that revenue to fund a renewal of local journalism. We suffer very badly from news deserts at this point, which are really eroding people's capacity to understand politics and all the elements at different jurisdictional levels. Also, a recommendation for something called the National Trust for Civic Infrastructure. to bring investment back into communities that have actually gone without investment in civic infrastructure for the last half century. In the third category of the work on our political culture, that includes recommendations, for example, around reinvestment in civic education. And I'll just you're doing a lot at Stanford on this. Professor Ober is really leading the charge here, but it's a really important sea change moment. We're at a point in the country where we spend about $50 of federal funds per year per kid on STEM education. And until about a year ago, we spent 5 cents per kid of federal dollars on civic education. We had a threefold increase, sounds like a lot, this past year. So we're now at 15 cents per kid, federal dollars for civic education. And so, you get what you pay for. So it's not about STEM versus civics. There's a both and need for investment in both of these categories of education. So that would give you a sense of some of the recommendations. Our report came out in 2020, as I mentioned, and we continue to work hard on implementation. A variety of the different recommendations have bills in Congress or other structures for seeking to move them forward. I personally have been putting my own energy and resources into two things. The recommendation to increase the size of the House of Representatives. There are 2 bills in Congress now to do that, actually. Representative Blumenauer from Oregon has one, and Representative Kasten from Illinois has another. But I'm sure you are sitting here and thinking, like, they can't even raise the debt ceiling, grow the size of the House. Like, Danielle, are you crazy? No, I'm not crazy. I'm just playing the long game, all right? Because we need to see the need for that, the importance of it, the necessity of it. And then the hope is that if we see the necessity for that, that might motivate some other work. In particular, the other thing that we really need to do is change how our election system operates at the state level. We need to get rid of party primaries. Party primaries have led to the sort of capture of our political institutions by a very small sliver of the electorate. So just to make it very crystal clear, Marjorie Taylor Greene was elected by 8% of the electorate in her district. And even AOC, and I'm not putting them in the same buckets at all, was elected by 5% of the electorate of her district. All right, so this is a result of combination of lots and lots of redistricting or sort of incumbent protection gerrymandering, producing non-competitive districts that are won in primaries where only a small percentage of the electorate turns out. And in that context, what you get is a structure of incentives for politicians that are primarily about preserving the power of the party. They're not about actually solving problems for the American people. So electoral systems that we've been experimenting with, Louisiana and California, you already have jungle primaries in top 2 elections. Alaska, even better model, I would say, introduced this last cycle top 4 approach. Nevada just passed top 5. And I think if we could get to top 4 and top 5 election systems at the state level, we would see a different set of incentives for elected officials in Congress. And that would give us the space for more independent decision-making, a little less sort of capture by parties, party discipline, a little more opportunity for real innovation and democracy renovation. So those would be my top 2 reforms, the increasing the size of the House, but getting to that by reforming how we run elections at the state level, and in particular by getting rid of the sort of monopoly control by party primaries, opening up that system so we have more voices flowing into the system, more diversity of debate, and so that candidates are campaigning to the general electorate, both in the preliminary moment and in the final round, and not just campaigning to sort of the activist sliver of party bases. So that's the picture of the work that we've done on the Our Common Purpose report. As I said, there are 31 recommendations, so I only just gave you, about a quarter of them. I'm happy to share more and to pursue whatever questions you have about any of the reforms that I did share. But thank you very much for your time and attention.
Let's come down to these microphones and speak into them.
thank you. It's very interesting, and I see how I can help out with some of these initiatives. What is your thought about I don't remember what it's called. It's many states saying that our electors are going to go to the winner, the popular vote winner of the entire country.
The National Popular Vote Compact.
Yeah, and it's got close to enough states already signed up.
Yes, that's a great question. So, if all the states choose to do that, then that would be a huge success and a valuable thing. I don't actually think we're likely to get to a place where we have a stable agreement among states in that regard. I think that's the case for the same reason that we ended up with the Electoral College in the first place, because the states still are meaningfully distinct jurisdictional places. I think they are anyway. This is one of the biggest questions that we have. And the smaller ones wanted protection in relationship to the bigger ones. Smaller states would lose that protection if that, in fact, unfolded in that direction. So I think for me, that's why the better solution, honestly, is to rebalance the Electoral College so that, yes, there's still some minority protection for smaller states, but it's not excessive. So the probability of a kind of misaligned outcome is extremely low, like much lower than it currently is, basically.
Hi, my name's Dave, all private citizen. It's interesting, two of the elements you're discussing are distinct in reality, but we're linking them together. Political culture, regulation of elections. Working in politics directly is a very educational experience. It can be easy to get a $5,000 check from a contributor because that's what he does. Try to get a $25 contribution from someone who's never participated in politics, it might take you 6 months. So it's something that people would want to come to once they've been involved in it, but you can't force them to do it. It's something that has to come from the people. We, the people, are the upper bound of our culture. So we've defaulted on some of our responsibilities. We can't expect to keep some of our freedoms. So we need to go one notch deeper in defining the issue, because it is up to us. Corruption and the forces seeking corruption are always going to be there. It's a matter of the culture of the people. What do you respond to that?
Thank you very much. I agree with you about the fundamental importance of the culture of the people, 100%. And I could say more about how we thought about that question of culture in the report. In the report, one of the things we are trying to do is point to the way in which institutions and culture are mutually reinforcing. So incentive structures can encourage patterns of behavior that can erode a good culture. And on the other hand, revised incentive structures can encourage patterns of behavior that can support a good culture. So, no, you can't get, I think you're right, to changed institutions without meaningful shift in culture first, in all probability. I think that's a sort of common view that culture is the more powerful force between the two. But by the same token, nor can you achieve, I think, sort of stable reinforcement of a healthy culture if you have a set of incentive structures that are consistently eroding that. So work has to be done on both fronts. And that's sort of just Madison, right? So, if you read the Federalist Papers, lots of times people think that, Madison said if men were angels, there'd be no need for government, and therefore we've produced checks and balances and so forth. But actually, he says, we need those checks and balances, and we need virtues. We need both of those things reinforcing each other.
Thanks so much for being here. I was just reading through the list of the suggestions, and, my first reaction was like, I have a hard time imagining the current Republican Party supporting most of or a good number of the ones I read through, and a couple I just take off. investment in civic education, requiring voting, public funding for public civic education, financing local journalism, expanding voting rights to convicted felons, public media campaigns, term limits. And I guess this gets to a larger question about, like, it seems pretty clear that we have a level of asymmetric polarization in a Republican Party that's pursuing an agenda that's not popular to most Americans. And so it's no, surprise that they're pursuing this through our, minoritarian institutions. So my question is whether you agree that most of these, I know you talked, this was a bipartisan initiative, but is it really, like, understanding where the energy and the power of the Republican Party is right now?
It's cross-ideological, right? That's important. It's an important distinction. So in other words, conservatives who had historically voted Republican were a part of the mix. But that's a different thing from saying the parties, right?
Yeah. So recognizing that, then my question is sort of what's the value of it then? And what do you do? Because it seems like what matters is actually how do you implement these things? And the Republican part is more important than the ideological part, particularly if the ideologues have defected from the Republican Party. So my question is, how do you actually implement and address these problems? Where can we make some inroads, understanding that the Republican Party that isn't necessarily committed to mass majoritarian democracy to achieve their policy agenda?
No, it's a super, super important question. And so just to clarify that, so I did use the phrase cross-ideological in order to distinguish from something which is about actually elected members of the parties coming together to work on something. The people in our group who are conservative, honestly, I think they were still voting Republican in the period of time we were working together. I don't know where they are right now. I can't, I just don't know. I can't speak to that. However, that distinction between people and parties is really important. So yes, every single one of those recommendations was supported by people who vote Republican. Okay, so that's an important thing. And there's evidence that that wasn't just in our group. If you take, for example, the state ballot proposition in Florida, I think in 2018, to restore the right to vote to people who have completed service of their felony conviction, that was a supermajority vote that took that through. I don't remember the actual number exactly. It was like 66, 67%, something like that. But then what happened, the Republican Party in the legislature walked it back. And so that's what we see over and over again, actually, is a split between the actual operations of the party and where voters are, including Republican and conservative voters. So that's where the issue of tackling the monopoly that sort of parties have acquired over our institutions is so important. And voting systems that take the power away from party primaries. Parties can still be strong and they can compete in a landscape of open preliminary elections. But that would give them less sort of control in that ability to sort of separate between what the electorate actually wants and what they're doing. In effect, they'd have to compete in relationship to the general electorate again, which they don't currently have to do. So that's why I think that set of reforms is so important. We have to unlock that so that parties are actually responsive to voters again, which right now they're not, especially on that side, to your asymmetrical point.
Hi, thanks so much for coming. This has been a really interesting and energizing talk. And my question for you is, what do you see as the role of lawyers, and especially new lawyers, in pushing for this renovation agenda? I think I'm the first year at Boston, and one thing I've noticed since coming here is that the scope of discourse around democracy reform is generally limited to a few narrow topics like districting and voter suppression, which are super important topics, but it doesn't usually move past the defensive of things that are objectively bad in your face right now. So I'm curious, what do you see as the broader role of new lawyers in space?
Thanks a lot for asking that. So we do have a sort of interesting situation where democracy work is largely tied to exactly the questions you pointed to, the right to vote and redistricting. And that makes sense because it comes out of the Voting Rights Act and achieving the right to vote for African Americans and securing that and so forth. So its importance is clear, but it has produced a sort of constrained field of vision in terms of what needs to be thought about for a healthy democracy. So I like to say to people, it's sort of, we need a kind of 360-degree picture. The right to vote is a cornerstone, for sure, but the right to vote doesn't get you anything if you don't have competitive elections. And so the right to run and competitive elections are also really important, but even that doesn't get you anything. You can't hold elected officials accountable if you can't also see what they're doing in office. So the right to vote and the right to run have to be accompanied by a sort of right to see and shape your community. That's where sort of issues of media and local journalism and campaign finance come in. So I think it would be extremely helpful if lawyers did more research on the second and third buckets, the right to run competitive elections and the sort of issue of democratic rights that we have in relationship to media, campaign finance, and the like. My hunch is that there will be some innovative legal strategies for achieving renovations in our democracy in those two buckets. But we spend so much time focusing on the first bucket that we're sort of like leaving a lot of stuff on the table in the second two buckets. Okay.
Thank you for speaking to us. I think because of the practical goals of this report, there's an extreme reluctance to recommend things that require constitutional amendments, which certainly makes sense. It seems impossible to do that right now. But it doesn't seem like the requirements make that necessary. I mean, there were moments in American history, the progressive era, the American people just seem to accept that this is a thing they can do, and then they do it repeatedly. I was wondering if there was any discussion about how to create a culture, a political culture in which we see constitutional amendments as a real, realizable aim, and if so, if you could shed light on the sort of things that have to exist for that to happen.
Sure, that's a great question. So I named our criteria: bold but feasible, achieve cross ideological support for each individual recommendation, and achieve unanimity for the whole set. And on the feasible point, the way we thought about that was for everything we're trying to do, we want to pull the lever that is the least difficult to pull. You want to sort of give yourself the easiest way of achieving that high impact, bold thing. That meant that we did try to avoid recommending constitutional amendments, but we did recommend one. So I want to go ahead and name that because it's important, because that tells you that's how important we thought it was. And it would be a constitutional amendment to undo the impact of Citizens United and make it possible to regulate campaign finance robustly. There is an organization called American Promise that is working really hard on achieving this constitutional amendment, and they are actually making progress. And we are at an interesting moment where various kinds of amendments are making progress, again, in a funny way. So the Equal Rights Amendment, for example, they did just suffer a sort of defeat in the Senate last week in not getting the deadline extended for ratification. But nonetheless, the point is just there's sort of a degree of energy and effort around constitutional amendments currently that I think we haven't seen in quite some time, would be my general estimate of it. But I would encourage you to check out American Promise. They're operating in every state at this point. They need people working in every state on this to get it through both houses of Congress and then get state ratification. But their list of supportive legislators is growing. So it's for real. They're actually really working on it.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. And I'm going to say a comment and question. So the comment is, I definitely like this notion of getting rid of permanent life appointments for the Supreme Court. I've been coming to this talk a few times, and that's one of the. So thank you so much. The second question is, isn't the California system disprove your recommendation? Because the last time that a Republican was selected statewide was in 2010. The end result, that's when the shift of two was put, except for presidential elections, I believe. As a result, I'm not a Democrat. I cannot vote for them because of their extreme pro-abortion views. I don't vote anymore. I am totally disenfranchised of state politics. The last time that I voted, that I was engaged, was when Donald Trump was elected. I voted just to send a FU to all these people. So can you comment on that? And my understanding is that Alaska, a similar situation has happened with the Republicans at the top two of the vote, but the Democrats ended up becoming elected. So isn't that a recipe to disenfranchise in the long term voters? Because that system will be gained, like it has been in California, by the party who has the most votes, disenfranchising everybody else. So thank you.
Nope, thank you for your question. So, for starters, the reason I think that top 5 is better than top 2 is precisely because then when you take 5 forward to the final round, you are actually getting a bigger spectrum of opinion. You're getting voice and choice for all voters is the expectation when you're taking 5 forward rather than 2. So that is actually, a way of improving on the Californian system in relationship to the kind of concern that you've just raised. Then you come to the final round, you've got those 5 candidates. And you use instant runoff so that whoever wins has to get over a 50% threshold, which is reasonable, right? That a person should, in fact, secure a majority of the vote before taking office. And so in the Alaska case, it's sort of super interesting because, yes, you had Sarah Palin and Mary Peltola, and then another Republican whose name I've forgotten. Bingo, right? There's a reason we've all forgotten his name. Okay? Anyway, so the point of saying all this is that, yes, so Sarah Palin is a very divisive figure. She would have won on a plurality vote, right? Whatever, 34% of the vote or something like that. But she has as many people, including Republicans, who can't stand her as anything else. So there's no sense in which there's any moral obligation or jurisprudential reason or matter of political principle to say that her voters should necessarily go to the next Republican. We do have a candidate-centric democracy. People like Mary Peltola as a human being. So she earned people's second choice vote. And that's the point, right? That's the sort of reasonable thing. So that is not disenfranchising people when they have that kind of spread of choice. Yeah.
I think the top 5 is...
Yeah, no, it makes a big difference in that regard. Yeah. And I think, that is, for me, some people will say, it should be 4, it should be 5. There's a sort of like crazy argument going on among, election nerds about whether it should be 4 or 5. 5 being thought of as the absolute limit because that's what humans cognitively can handle making a judgment about, is the general view. But I think 5 is better than 4 because we're an incredibly diverse society. And one of the things that we really need to do is to sort of channel that diversity into processes that are actually competitive and synthetic and things like that.
I agree with that. I think that if it's 5, probably the more diverse thing will be.
Yeah, thank you.
So speaking of, thank you for coming, this is wonderful. Speaking of campaign finance reform, there's a Washington Post opinion piece today. So unfair question, maybe you haven't seen it, but the title, I've read the title and the summary, I haven't read through it. The thesis is that small donors have wrecked democracy in the United States currently because people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and so on are able to, what I would call KFAB or kayfabe politicians have been able to, win. And that's not what I expected to see, so I'm really intrigued to read it. I may not have, if you haven't read it, it's an unfair question. You could say, ask me later, but do you have any opinions about the pros and cons of small donors?
Yeah, it's a great question. In general, I personally find the campaign finance questions the hardest ones to think about. As a matter of general principle, I am very supportive of the participation of small donors. And I am a fan, for example, of a reform that is, I believe, in Seattle, where they've started using what are called democracy vouchers. Every voter gets a $25 voucher that they can contribute to a candidate. The candidates, therefore, in the sort of round of raising money, can reasonably campaign to everybody and sort of work to collect that. And New York actually has something similar operating. And in both cases, it has actually really transformed who's running for office and who's winning as well. It's really diversifying the election system. So in principle, I'm a big supporter of small donors. I think the issue that you're pointing to there is just the fact that Marjorie Taylor Greene can draw from a national donor community. So it's not about the sort of smallness of the donation. It's the fact that in a world of media, social media, she has a national donor base. And so I think it's that kind of problem. It's sort of thinking about the impacts of social media more than it's about small donors. But I haven't read the piece yet, so that's based on what you said. Okay.
At Thank you for being here. I wonder if your commission explored the possibility of just publicly funded elections.
Yes, and we did recommend improved public finance for elections. So Connecticut has a really great public finance model. There's a sort of Seattle model of democracy vouchers. Connecticut has a terrific model too, where the sort of just the actual allocation of resources to candidates is sufficient for people to run meaningful campaigns. So they too have a above average degree of diversity in their candidates and in their electoral outcomes, and robust debate in the course of elections. So yes, we did endorse public finance.
Hi, thanks for coming. I was wondering, you talked about ranked choice voting, and I hear a lot of people recommend that, and you said you do kind of a lot of advocacy on it. What are the counter arguments? Like, what are you running up against? Like, why do people resist it, I guess, because you don't see it in a couple of places?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So the typical argument that's made these days in politics is that it's too complicated for voters, that voters have trouble understanding how to think about a ranked ballot. I think that's a red herring argument. The real and substantive argument or concern that one should have about ranked choice voting is that you do have to pay attention to the context of use. If ranked choice voting is used in the wrong kind of context, it can be very disempowering of minorities. So for example, think about the South. If you have municipal elections where you're just, there's a sort of a single winner, it's a sort of single member district, and it's ranked choice voting, the majority, ethnic majority will always win, and then you have sort of real disempowerment. Whereas a plurality voting system means, somebody coming from a minority community could actually get through if the majority community splinters. So that has historically been a concern, and we used to have a set of structures that made it easier to do ranked choice voting that were actually gotten rid of by legislation in the 60s as a part of trying to protect the right to vote for African Americans and the power of the vote for African Americans. So the good news is that the ranked choice voting advocacy community these days, when they're advocating for specific things, is advocating with that worry in mind, and so is advocating for the use of RCV in context where it won't have that kind of implication. So it gets very technical, and I can say more if you want to chat afterwards, but that's the really substantive thing to worry about.
Hi, Professor Allen. You mentioned the roots of the American Academy in being a group of learned professions, and you also talked about how the stratification in the last sort of generation or so has really impacted the composition of the Academy. And I'm curious if you have thoughts or if this process has changed your thoughts about the role of the Academy in leading conversations about the structure of the country, democracy, renovations, like you said.
Interesting. So I appreciate your question. I think I think you're right to put questions of stratification together with the Academy, although I don't know that I meant to do that in the remarks I made. So I think you may be making an important connection beyond, in fact, what I articulated. So let me make sure I understand what you're saying first. So is the point that when I made the point about our desire to have listening sessions around the country being not just sort of your old-fashioned way of having experts do things, and that sounded like a response to stratification, or?
It's really thinking about the American Academy as a place that is very focused on the role of academics in shaping, providing ideas for this kind of reform, and how, given the structural forces that are changing who gets to the Academy, cause you to choose pathways like, seek different types of public input or think about your own role in that conversation.
I see. Interesting. Okay. Yeah, it's a good question. That's a good question. I mean, it's funny. The Academy is more diverse, by measures of sort of gender and ethnicity than at any point in its history. At the same time, it is the case that anybody who's a member of it is also a member of an elite in this society, right? So a professional elite and, in some sense, also an income elite. And that is more extreme now than it would have been 50 years ago. So by social dimensions, it's more diverse. By economic dimensions, it's probably less diverse than it was. And I think it's a good question. I'll have to admit, I'm not sure we actually have thought about that enough or talked about it enough. It is the case that one of the results of our own commission work was that then the Academy decided to do its next commission on questions of political economy. Because as we were doing the work on the democracy questions, over and over again, the sort of thing that came up was, but doesn't this all break against the hard facts of the economic realities and the realities of economic inequality in this country? And we don't really have answers to that question in the report. We think there are answers in the sense that many of us in our commission work were of the view that if we had an improvement with regard to the inclusivity and responsiveness of our democratic institutions, that would actually result in a political economy that was also healthier for the society. But we didn't do a deep dive on that hypothesis or sort of fully spell it out. So, to your point, the Academy, we sort of did encounter the challenges of questions of political economy, and it has resulted in another round of commission work focused on that.
Professor Allen, first of all, thank you very much for giving this talk. My question is regarding my perception. My perception is that if I remove the lunatic fringe on the left and the lunatic fringe on the right, then you get left with the vast majority of people that want to do the right thing. And so as you went through and talked to all these different groups throughout the country, am I off base with that, or am I on track with that? It just seems like the fringes on both sides suck up all the air out of the room, both in terms of the media as well as social media, and they dominate the discussion. And to me, that's not right.
So you are right about half of the story. And the fact that you are right can be seen in state-level ballot propositions. I referred to the one in Florida, for example, but that's not anomalous. We achieve supermajorities across the country with a surprisingly regular basis or frequency. So Mississippi, I believe, in 2020, replaced its state flag in order to get rid of emblems of the Confederacy and adapt forward-facing icons with a supermajority vote. In Massachusetts, we regularly have supermajority votes. For example, one on the right to repair, which was giving sort of small auto shops access to the data in cars, so they're not just sort of dominated by big auto companies and sort of big tech firms. So there's a kind of basic, where you look at Kansas and sort of work that was done on abortion just immediately previous to us. You look across the country, and what you do see is supermajorities forming around basically like defending the person who's getting the short end of the stick. So there is a kind of basic fairness, basic sort of moral compass that spans, left, center right, et cetera, big chunk of people. So that's true, and then that's then where the kind of question of the party monopoly comes in, sort of like a distorting of where the people actually are. But then here's the other really important other half of the story that also makes it non-symmetrical, okay? I'm a Washington Post columnist. I wrote a load of pieces in 2015 and 16 against Trump. I was sort of one of the first columnists to say, we've got to take this seriously, people. Like, there's something happening here, and it's not good. So, I wrote my heart out. Didn't make any difference whatsoever. That was a real learning. But anyway, I tried. But as a result of doing that, I got a load of death threats and, just hate stuff like images of nooses being tweeted at me and gas ovens and death threats on my voicemail and stuff like that. And it was affecting me. It was making me, all anonymous. It was like making me sort of like literally not want to go outside. It's like, who out there actually hates me? Like, which of the people out there are the ones who are feeling that way toward me? And I don't like that kind of feeling. I don't like to feel trapped in that way. And so I knew I had to do something about it. So I asked a friend of mine who, is a sort of expert in social media, archaeology and stuff like that, to try to figure out where it was coming from. And to our great surprise, it was mostly coming from Eastern Europe. Okay? Which was great, because I was like, I can love my fellow Americans again. It was hugely liberating to see that. And then, of course, we got all the intelligence reports confirming. So we figured this out before those intelligence reports came out. But the reason I'm saying this is because it is literally true that there is a global network of right-wing extremists who are working really hard to radicalize people in this country. All right? So the fact that there's asymmetry is not just about the kind of internal dynamics of our parties. And I'm not just talking about Russia. It's not just about like stuff Russia is doing. It's literally, it's sort of like the reverse of the, Communist Internationale. Like it's a far-right global network, and they are seeking to sow division in this country. My favorite example of the work, although in this case this is a Russian example, and this was in the intelligence reports, was in Texas. There was one incident where there was, a protest, an anti-Islamic protest on one side of the street near the Capitol, and then a defense of Islamic people on the other side of the street, which ended up in a physical conflict, both of which created by Russian Facebook groups. Okay? So that's how serious the work of people external to our borders is. And so that's why, like when we're talking about, when I said our biggest challenge is we don't know how to name the bond we have with each other, it's our biggest vulnerability. And the rest of the world knows that. And they are literally taking advantage of that. So all these questions are really a matter of basic national security as well. So.
I'm sorry, but our time has come. And please join me in thanking Danielle Allen. The next Conn Law Center event is our conference, which is the Friday and Saturday of May 17th and 18th?
19th and 20th.
19th and 20th. So this is on the topic of, the title is Text and what kind of history about constitutional interpretation in the Supreme Court these days. It is an all-star cast of people, of speakers from around the country. So please join us for that. And again, one last round of applause.